The hunt had yielded little. Eddard Stark rode through Winterfell's eastern gate as the sun began its descent behind the western walls, painting the ancient stones in shades of amber and rust. 3 rabbits and a young doe hung from his saddle. Modest fare, but enough. Winter was coming, as it always did, and the hunting would only grow leaner in the moons ahead. Already the air carried that peculiar sharpness that spoke of the season's turn, a bite that went deeper than mere cold. The stable boys took his horse without need for instruction. Ned dismounted with the practiced ease of a man who had been riding since before he could properly walk, his boots finding familiar purchase on the packed earth of the yard. Around him, Winterfell breathed with its customary rhythm, the ring of hammers from the forge, the calls of men at their training, the creak of the great wheel that drew water from the deep wells. Home. After all his years, after the Eyrie and the rebellion and the Crown's shadow, this was still the only place that deserved the name. Successful day, my lord. Jory Cassell approached from the direction of the armory, his face ruddy from the cold, or perhaps from supervising the boys at their swordwork. Successful enough. Ned pulled off his riding gloves, flexing fingers stiff from hours gripping leather reins. The game grows scarcer. The forest knows what we don't wish to admit. Jory nodded, understanding passing between them without need for elaboration. Both men had seen enough winters to read the signs, the restlessness in the animals, the unusual silence among the birds, the way frost lingered longer each morning in the shadowed places. The maesters could track their seasons by stars and charts, but Northmen knew winter in their blood and bones. "Will you sup in the great hall tonight, my lord?" Jory asked. Ned paused, considering. Most nights he took his meals simply, often in his solar with Catelyn, reviewing the endless accounts and correspondence that governing required. But something in the afternoon stillness, in the quality of light slanting through the trees, had stirred a different impulse in him. "Aye," he said, "have word sent to Lady Catelyn. We'll gather the family properly tonight. All of them." Even John, he thought, but did not say. Jory, who had served House Stark since before Ned's birth, simply nodded and departed to make the arrangements. The great hall of Winterfell had stood for thousands of years, raised by Brandon the Builder in the Age of Heroes, or so the stories claimed. Ned had learned long ago that the stories were often more important than the truth, particularly in the north, where winter could last a generation and people needed their legends to survive the darkness. The hall stretched vast and high, its rafters lost in shadow even when every torch blazed. Along the walls hung the banners of houses sworn to Winterfell, their colours muted by smoke and time. Karstark, Umber, Flint, Mormont, and dozens more, each name carrying the weight of oaths spoken and bloodshed. Tonight, the long tables had been pushed to the sides, leaving the centre space open before the great hearth. The fire roared high, fed with oak and pine that crackled and spat sparks up toward the ancient stones. Heat rolled out in waves, pushing back against the cold that seeped perpetually through Winterfell's walls, despite the hot springs that ran beneath. Ned had commanded a more intimate arrangement, a semicircle of chairs and cushioned seats drawn close to the warmth, where a family might gather rather than a lord holding court. He stood with his back to the fire, hands clasped behind him, and watched his family assemble. Catelyn entered first, as was proper. She moved with the grace learned in Riverrun's more refined halls, though she had long since adapted to the North's rougher ways. Her auburn hair caught the firelight as she approached, and Ned felt the familiar warmth that her presence always kindled. 14 years they had been wed, and still the sight of her stirred something deeper than duty. Ned. She took his hand briefly, a gesture of affection she rarely permitted in public. This is unexpected. Sometimes I tire of expectation, he replied quietly. Let us have one evening that's simply ours. Before... He didn't finish the thought. Before Robert arrives with his court and his demands. Before the world intrudes again. But Catelyn understood. She always did, and squeezed his fingers once before taking her seat. The children came in varying states of eagerness. Robb entered with the bearing of a young man conscious of his position as heir, though he was barely 14. He had Catelyn's colouring, but the stark features, the long face, the grey eyes, the solemn set to his mouth that made him look older than his years. He nodded respectfully to his parents before settling into his seat, already carrying himself like the lord he would someday become. Sansa glided in beside him, nearly 12 and already showing signs of the beauty she would grow into. She had her mother's Tully looks completely. The auburn hair, the blue eyes, the fine bones of face that spoke of southern bloodlines. She curtsied prettily and took her seat with the careful grace of a girl who had been practicing courtesies since she could walk. Her sceptre had trained her well, perhaps too well. Sometimes Ned wondered if Winterfell would ever truly be home to her, or if she was already dreaming of southern courts and tawny nights. Arya bounded in like a sudden storm, her dress already somehow smudged despite the evening's early hour. At 9 she was all angles and energy, her hair escaping whatever arrangement had been attempted. She bore the Stark look as surely as Robb, but where his solemnity suggested their father's measured justice, Arya's intensity recalled wilder blood, Brandon's recklessness, Lyanna's fierce spirit. Ned's chest tightened at the thought of his sister gone, these 14 years and more. "Must I sit?" Arya asked, eyeing the formal arrangement with clear suspicion. "You must," Catelyn said firmly, though not unkindly, "and sit still, if the old gods are merciful." Bran came next, 7 years old, and already restless with the same energy that drove Arya, though manifested differently. Where she chafed at the constraints of ladyhood, Bran simply couldn't contain his enthusiasm for the world. He climbed everything, explored everywhere, asked questions that even the maesters struggled to answer. He took his seat between his sisters, but immediately began craning his neck to examine the old shields mounted high on the walls. Little Rickon toddled in, holding the hand of his nurse, 3 years old and still more baby than boy. His dark hair stuck up in tufts, and he looked about the hall with wide grey eyes, uncertain whether this gathering meant something pleasant or punitive. Theon Greyjoy arrived with the careful diffidence of someone never quite certain of his welcome. The Greyjoy boy, ward and hostage both, though none spoke that truth aloud, had lived at Winterfell for 9 years now, since his father's failed rebellion. He was 19, cocky and skilled with bow and blade, and Ned had tried to raise him as he would his own sons. But the Ironborn were a different people, worshipping different gods, dreaming different dreams. Theon took his place at the edge of the gathering, present but apart. Last came Jon Snow. Ned's bastard entered quietly, as he did most things, taking a seat farthest from the fire's centre. At 14, Jon looked more like Ned than any of his true-born sons, the long, stark face, the dark hair, the grey eyes that missed little. He had a gravity about him that went beyond his years, the weight that all bastards carried of knowing they must prove themselves twice over to earn half the respect. Ned met his son's eyes across the gathering and nodded slightly. Jon returned the gesture, his expression giving nothing away. "Is everyone settled?" Ned asked, his voice carrying easily in the stone hall. A chorus of assents, childish and adult alike. "Good." He remained standing, the fire warm at his back. "Winter is coming. I need not tell any of you this. You've heard it since you could understand words. It is our house's warning and our truth. But tonight, with autumn fading and the cold settling in, I find myself thinking not of winter's hardships, but of what we hold against them." He paused, gathering his thoughts. Political speeches came easier to him than this, the simple truth of feeling laid bare. "We hold each other," he continued. "Family, blood and bone, the bonds that make us Starks of Winterfell, that have kept our line strong for 8,000 years. He allowed himself a slight smile. "Or 4,000, if you believe the Meisters rather than the singers." Bran giggled at that. Even Arya's restlessness stilled. "I would have us spend this evening together," Ned said. "Not as lord and lady and children, not practicing courtesies for visiting kings." Sansa's eyes brightened at that mention. "But as we are, sharing stories, remembering who we were and are, the histories of our houses, the small memories that bind us." "Will there be old Nan's tales?" Bran asked hopefully. "Perhaps later," Catelyn said, her voice warm with amusement. "Though if we start with tales of the others, none of you shall sleep tonight." "I wouldn't be afraid," Arya declared immediately. "Of course not," Robb said dryly. "You'd probably try to fight them." Arya stuck her tongue out at her brother, and even Sansa smiled behind her hand at the breach of courtesy. Ned settled into his chair at last, accepting a cup of mulled wine from a servant. Around him, his family did the same. Wine watered for the younger children, warm cider for Rickon. The fire crackled and popped, sending shadows dancing across the ancient stones. Outside, night was falling in earnest, and with it came the wind that always found its way through Winterfell's passages, moaning like distant wolves. "Where shall we begin?" Catelyn asked, her hand finding Ned's armrest, fingers brushing his. Ned thought of all the stories he could tell, of the rebellion and the war, of his father and brother's deaths, of promises made and secrets kept, of Tower of Joy and what lay buried there in his heart, never to be spoken. But those were not stories for this night, not for these children who still looked at him with trust in their eyes. "Tell us of when you were young, father," Robb said, "before the war, when Uncle Brandon and Aunt Lyanna lived." The request struck deep, as perhaps Robb had meant it to. His eldest son was perceptive, already learning to see beneath the surface of things. Ned drew a slow breath, feeling Catelyn's hand tighten slightly on the armrest, her silent support. "Very well," he said softly. "Let me tell you of Winterfell when I was a boy, when these halls rang with different voices and the dead still walked among us. The fire burned bright, the family drew close, and for one evening, perhaps one of the last such evenings they would ever have, the Starks of Winterfell held the approaching darkness at bay with nothing more than memory, love, and the warmth of kinship that even winter could not wholly freeze." Catelyn Stark watched her husband's face as he prepared to speak of the dead. 14 years she had been Lady of Winterfell, 14 years of learning to read the subtle shifts in Eddard Stark's expressions, the tightening around his eyes that spoke of old pain, the slight tension in his jaw when memories pressed too close. She had never met Brandon or Lyanna Stark, those legendary siblings whose ghosts still walked these halls in whispered stories and carefully avoided references. They had died before she ever came north, before Robert's rebellion reshaped the realm, before she had become part of this family's long and grieving history. Yet she knew them in her way. She knew them through Ned's silences, through the flowers he still brought to the crypts on certain days, through the way his hand would sometimes pause on Arya's wild dark hair with an expression of such mingled love and sorrow that it made Catelyn's heart ache. Brandon was the eldest, Ned began, his voice steady but quiet, pitched for the intimate gathering rather than the formal pronouncements of lordship. Heir to Winterfell, born to rule, he was everything a Stark should be, strong, fierce, quick to laugh, and quicker to fight. "Did he look like us, father?" Robb asked, leaning forward with the eagerness of a boy seeking connection to his bloodline. "Aye." A ghost of a smile touched Ned's lips. "More like you and Arya than me. I took after our father, quieter, more inclined to thought than action. Brandon was different. He was like summer lightning over the Wolfswood, all flash and fury and impossible to ignore." Theon Greyjoy shifted in his seat, his expression carefully neutral. Catelyn noticed, as she often did, the way the Ironborn boy positioned himself always at the gathering's edge, present, but prepared to be excluded. She wondered sometimes if Ned saw it, if he understood that 9 years of fosterage had not truly made Theon a Stark, could never erase the salt and iron of his true heritage. "I remember," Ned continued, his gaze growing distant as memory claimed him, "when I was perhaps 6 years old, which would have made Brandon 8, he decided the youngest of the stable boys was being treated too roughly by the master of horse. The boy was Ironborn, taken in some raid, or reaving along the stony shore, no more than 10 himself." Theon's attention sharpened at that detail. Catelyn filed it away, another small piece of understanding. "Brandon challenged the master of horse," Ned said, "not with words. My brother was never much for debate, but with a practice sword. Said if the man was going to beat a child for minor failings, he should face someone who could fight back." "What happened?" Bran asked, his eyes wide. "Father thrashed Brandon for his insolence," Ned replied. "But the beating stopped. Brandon took his punishment without complaint, satisfied he'd achieved what mattered." He paused, and something like pride entered his voice, despite the sadness that shadowed it. That was Brandon. He acted first and accepted consequences after, but he acted. Always. Arya sat straighter, her sharp little face intent. Catelyn recognized the expression, her daughter absorbing a lesson, adding it to whatever collection of ideas and impulses drove her increasingly ungovernable behavior. Sometimes Catelyn wondered if having examples of wild Stark women in the family history helped or hindered her efforts to raise a proper lady. "He was betrothed to Mother," Sansa said suddenly, the romantic notion clearly captivating her. Before everything changed." Catelyn met her daughter's eyes and nodded. "He was. Our fathers arranged the match when I was very young. I never met him, but Lord Rickard sent his portrait south to Riverrun." She smiled slightly, remembering her girlish examination of that painting, trying to imagine the fierce northern lord as her future husband. He was handsome, dark-haired, grey-eyed, with a smile that the painter somehow managed to capture even in a formal portrait. "Did you love him?" Sansa asked, her voice soft, with the question only a romantic 11-year-old would dare voice. "I didn't know him," Catelyn answered gently. "Love in such matters comes after marriage, if the gods are kind. Duty comes first." "That's not love," Arya muttered. "That's just arrangement." "Arrangement built the 7 kingdoms," Ned said, his tone not sharp, but firm enough to quiet his daughter's rebellion. "Every great house owes its existence to carefully planned marriages, to alliances forged through bloodlines. Brandon understood this. He would have honoured his commitment to Catelyn's family, would have been a good husband." He looked at Catelyn then, and she saw the unspoken truth in his eyes. "But I am glad fate turned as it did. I am glad you are mine." She felt warmth rise in her cheeks and looked away, focusing on the children to hide the feeling that still, after all these years, could make her feel like a new bride. "Brandon was the finest swordsman in the north," Ned continued, steering back to safer waters. "Better than me, certainly. He trained obsessively, rising before dawn to work with master-at-arms. I remember winter mornings when I'd wake to the sound of steel on steel in the yard. Brandon already hours into his practice, while the rest of Winterfell still slept." "Is that why you make us train so much?" Robb asked. "I make you train," Ned said, "because winter is coming and soft men don't survive hard seasons. But yes, Brandon's example taught me the value of discipline paired with natural skill. He had both." "Tell us about Aunt Lyanna," Arya demanded, unable to contain herself longer. Of all the children, she had seized most fiercely on the fragments she'd gathered about Ned's sister. The aunt who'd ridden like a Northman, who'd defied expectations, who'd died young and tragic in circumstances no one would fully explain. Ned's expression shifted, grief cutting deeper now. Catelyn reached over and laid her hand on his, a gesture of support and permission both. He gripped her fingers gratefully. "Lyanna," he said softly, and even speaking her name seemed to cost him something. She was like winter roses blooming in snow, beautiful and fierce and impossible to tame, though many tried. "She was betrothed to King Robert," Sansa said, her voice reverent. The tragedy of it clearly appealed to her romantic sensibilities. A beautiful maiden, a great lord, love destroyed by war. "She was," Ned confirmed, though something in his tone made Catelyn wonder, as she had before, about the true nature of that arrangement. Robert spoke of Lyanna with the fervour of obsessive love, even now 14 years after her death. But Ned's memories seemed more complex, shadowed by knowledge he would not share. "Did she love him?" Arya asked, echoing her sister's earlier question. "She was 15 when she died," Ned said quietly. "Younger than Robb is now. Too young for anyone to say what she might have come to feel, given time and peace." He paused. "What I can tell you is that Lyanna was no simpering maiden waiting for rescue. She could ride better than Brandon, which galled him endlessly. She was fearless on horseback. I once saw her jump a fence that made grown men hesitate." "Father would have been furious," Ned continued, and now a smile ghosted across his face, despite the sorrow. Rickard Stark was a hard man, stern in the old way of northern lords. He believed in order, hierarchy, tradition. Brandon he understood, for all my brother's wildness. Brandon was clearly strong, clearly fit to lead. But Lyanna, he shook his head. She defied easy categorization. She wouldn't embroider when she could ride, wouldn't practice courtesies when she could practice with wooden swords alongside the boys. She sang beautifully, I remember that. Songs of the first men, old ballads that made even the hardest men grow quiet. Like Arya, Bran observed with the blunt honesty of childhood. Catelyn saw Arya's expression, caught between pride at the comparison and something else, something almost fearful. Did the child understand that her aunt's story ended in tragedy? Did she grasp that defiance, however noble, carried consequences? In some ways, Ned acknowledged, though Lyanna was more controlled. She knew when to bend, when to show the Southern Lords what they expected to see. She could play the lady when necessary. I could too, Arya said defensively, if I wanted to. The question, Catelyn interjected gently, is whether you will when you must, darling, not when you want to. Arya scowled but subsided, and Sansa allowed herself a small, superior smile that Catelyn pretended not to notice. There was a tourney, Ned said, his voice dropping lower, as if the memory itself demanded quieter tones. At Harrenhal, just before the rebellion, the greatest tourney in living memory, lords and ladies from all the 7 kingdoms gathered. Robert was there, and Brandon and Lyanna. I attended as well, though I had little taste for such spectacles. The children leaned in, even Jon emerging slightly from his customary shadows at the gathering's edge. What happened? Robb asked. Ned seemed to choose his words with unusual care. There was an incident. A knight, lesser-born, defending a small mystery knight from harassment by cruel squires. Lyanna. He paused. She had strong feelings about injustice, about the strong preying on the weak. She would have intervened herself, I think. But the knight acted first. Catelyn noticed what Ned left unsaid, the gaps in his, telling. She had heard enough whispers over the years, fragments from old Nan and visiting bannermen, to know that Harrenhal's tourney had been the beginning of everything, the rebellion, the deaths, the war that had reshaped the realm. But the full truth remained locked in Ned's silence. The mystery knight was called the Knight of the Laughing Tree, Ned continued. Small of stature, carrying a shield painted with a weirwood face, the knight defeated the 3 squires' masters in the lists, demanded they teach their men honour, then vanished before being unmasked. Who was it? Bran asked breathlessly. No one knows for certain, Ned said, which Catelyn suspected was not quite truth. But Lyanna laughed when I told her of it afterward, laughed like she knew a secret that delighted her. She was the knight, Arya said with absolute conviction. Wasn't she? Aunt Lyanna was the Knight of the Laughing Tree. Ned looked at his daughter for a long moment, and Catelyn saw old pain and reluctant admiration war in his expression. If she was, he said finally, she never admitted it, and the truth died with her. The fire crackled in the silence that followed. Little Rickon had fallen asleep in his nurse's arms, and even Bran had grown quiet, sensing the weight of adult sorrow settling over the gathering. I wish I'd known them, Robb said softly. Uncle Brandon and Aunt Lyanna both. I wish you had as well, Ned replied. They would have loved you all. Brandon would have trained you boys until you could barely stand, pushed you harder than I ever do. And Lyanna. His voice caught slightly. She would have adored Arya, would have protected her right to be herself, even as she taught her when to show the world what it expected. Arya's face had gone very still, and Catelyn saw tears threatening in her daughter's grey eyes, a rare sight. The girl fought them back with visible effort. What I want you to understand, Ned said, addressing all the children now, his voice carrying the weight of lessons learned in blood and grief, is that Brandon and Lyanna were extraordinary, bright and fierce and brave. But their stories ended in tragedy because the world is not kind to those who act solely on passion, no matter how noble their intentions. He looked at each child in turn. Robb, Sansa, Arya, Bran, even Jon in his shadowed seat. Brandon heard that Lyanna had been taken by Prince Rhaegar Targaryen. He rode straight to King's Landing in his fury, demanded the prince face him in single combat. It was brave, it was foolish. King Aerys had him arrested for threatening the crown prince. Then he sent for our father, and when father came... Ned's voice went flat, emotionless in the way Catelyn had learned meant he was feeling too much. Aerys burned them both. Brandon strangled himself trying to reach his sword, trying to save father, while father burned alive in his armor. Sansa gasped softly. Even Theon looked shaken. "That's horrible," Arya whispered. "That's what happens," Ned said, "when passion overrules judgment, when courage becomes recklessness." Brandon acted as Brandon always did, immediately, fiercely, convinced his strength and conviction would carry the day. But some battles cannot be won with swords alone. "And Aunt Lyanna?" Robb asked quietly. "Died in a tower in Dawn," Ned said, his voice barely audible now. "Too young, too soon, and all I could do was promise." He stopped, catching himself. "All I could do was bring her home to the crypts, to rest beside Brandon and father and all the Starks who came before." Catelyn squeezed his hand, feeling the old grief that never fully left him. She thought of the three who lay in those crypts, the family Ned had lost before she ever knew him. Brandon, who should have been her husband. Lyanna, who should have been her sister by marriage, should have lived to see her children grow. Lord Rickard, who should have seen his grandchildren born. Instead, war and madness had taken them all, leaving Ned, the quiet second son, never meant to rule, as Lord of Winterfell. "I tell you these stories," Ned said, "not to burden you with sorrow, but so you understand. We are Starks. We endure. We remember. We carry our dead with us, learn from their mistakes, honor their memory by living better than they could." He looked at Arya directly. "Be fierce, daughter, but be wise as well. The world has enough dead heroes." Then to Robb. "Be strong, son, but remember that strength without judgment is simply another form of weakness." The weight of his words settled over the gathering like snow, quiet and inexorable. The fire burned lower now, shadows lengthening across the ancient stones. Outside, the wind had risen, moaning through Winterfell's passages with the voice of approaching winter. Catelyn looked at her children, at their serious faces, at the way they absorbed their father's lessons, and felt the familiar mixture of love and fear that motherhood brought. They were so young still, so unaware of how quickly the world could turn cruel. She wanted to gather them close, protect them from every hard truth, every future sorrow. But she was Lady of Winterfell now, mother to future lords and ladies. Her duty was not to shield them from reality, but to prepare them for it. "Your father is right," she said, her voice carrying across the hall. "But I would add this. Brandon and Lyanna, for all their tragic ends, lived fully. They loved fiercely, acted with conviction, left marks on the world that outlasted their brief years. There is honor in that as well." Ned looked at her, surprised and grateful, and she smiled at him. "Now," she said more briskly, "I think we've had enough northern tragedy for one evening." let me tell you stories of Riverrun, where I grew up, of my father and mother, of your Uncle Edmure's misadventures, of a world where water runs swift and words can be as powerful as swords. The mood shifted, lightening, as Catelyn claimed the telling. The children settled back, and even Arya's tension eased slightly. The fire crackled warm, the wine flowed, and for a little longer the Starks of Winterfell held the darkness at bay. Catelyn shifted in her seat, arranging her skirts with the unconscious grace of a high-born lady. The weight of Ned's stories still hung in the air, the ghosts of Brandon and Lyanna hovering at the edges of firelight. But she sensed the children needed something different now, something less shadowed by northern grief and old God's silence. "The Riverlands," she began, her voice taking on a different quality, warmer perhaps, less weighted with the stone and ice of Winterfell's ancient halls, "are nothing like the North. When I first came here as Ned's bride, I thought I had journeyed to the edge of the world. Everything was so vast, so empty." Sansa leaned forward with interest. Of all her children, Sansa had always been most fascinated by her mother's tales of the South, the world beyond Winterfell's cold embrace, where knights were gallant and ladies were beautiful, and everything seemed touched by the songs and stories that filled her daughter's romantic imagination. "Riverrun sits at the joining of the Tumblestone and the Red Fork," Catelyn continued, closing her eyes briefly to call forth the memory with perfect clarity. "Water surrounds it on 3 sides, and during times of trouble, we can raise the drawbridge and flood the moat, turning the castle into an island. I grew up with the sound of running water always in my ears, rushing, tumbling, never still. It's why our words are family, duty, honor. Water shapes stone over time, finds its path through persistence rather than force." "That's different from winter is coming," Bran observed, his young face scrunched in thought. "Very different," Catelyn agreed. "Your father's house warns of hardship ahead, reminds the North to prepare and endure. My father's house speaks of the bonds that sustain us through hardship, the responsibilities we owe, the integrity we must maintain. Both are necessary truths, but they approach the world from different directions." She glanced at Ned, saw his slight nod of acknowledgement. They had navigated these differences for 14 years now, the Stark rigidity and the Tully flexibility, the northern tendency toward isolation and the Riverland's necessity of alliance and negotiation. Sometimes the differences still chafed. More often they complemented each other in ways that strengthened them both. "My father, your grandfather, Hoster Tully," Catelyn said, addressing the children with the particular warmth she always felt when speaking of her father in his prime, before illness had begun to weaken him, "was a man who understood that strength comes in many forms. He could fight when needed. Indeed, he was formidable in battle, but he preferred to win his victories through words and careful planning." "Like a game of Saivas," Robb said, showing the strategic mind that would serve him well as Lord of Winterfell someday. "Exactly like Saivas." Catelyn smiled at her eldest son. Father would often say that any fool can start a war, but it takes wisdom to prevent one, or to ensure that if war comes, you fight it on terms favourable to your house. Theon Greyjoy shifted in his seat, his expression carefully neutral. Catelyn wondered what he thought of such talk, he whose father had started a war on distinctly unfavourable terms and lost everything: his crown, his sons, his freedom. The Ironborn way was not the Tully way, not the careful negotiation and alliance building that had made House Tully powerful despite holding some of the most contested land in Westeros. "Tell us about when you were a girl," Sansa urged. "What was it like growing up at River Run?" Catelyn let herself drift back, sifting through memories like river stones. "River Run was, livelier than Winterfell," she said carefully, not wanting to disparage her adopted home, but acknowledging truth. "More visitors, more trade, more constant movement. We sat at the centre of the realm in many ways. Roads from every direction met at our borders. King's Landing to the south, the Vale to the east, the north beyond the Neck, the Westerlands across the Red Fork." "That sounds dangerous," Arya said. "All those different people, all those borders to defend." "It was," Catelyn acknowledged. "Is. The Riverlands have been battleground more times than our masters can count. But Father taught us that being at the crossroads means you have opportunity as well as danger. Every traveller is a potential source of information. Every merchant brings news along with goods. Every visiting lord's son is a chance to forge new bonds." She paused, remembering her father in his solar, teaching her to read the subtle currents of politics the way he read the currents in the rivers. Hoster Tully had not limited his instruction to his son and heir. He had taught Catelyn and Lysa both, understanding that daughters married into other houses carried their family's interests with them. "When I was perhaps 8 years old," Catelyn continued, "Father took me to the Watergate to watch a merchant fleet arrive from the south. 12 ships laden with goods from King's Landing and beyond. Dornish wine, Myrish lace, even books from the Citadel. I remember being dazzled by the colours, the sounds, the foreign tongues of sailors." Sansa's eyes gleamed with the romance of it. "Father made me watch the negotiations," Catelyn said. "Hours of it. Our castellan discussing prices, inspecting goods, arguing over quality and quantity. I grew bored and restless, wanted to return to the castle. But Father insisted I stay." "Why?" Bran asked. "Because afterward he asked me what I had observed. I said I'd seen a boring business transaction. He said I'd seen the foundation of our house's power, the ability to negotiate fairly, to recognize value, to build relationships that would bring those merchants back season after season." Catelyn smiled at the memory. "Then he asked me which merchant I thought was most honest. I pointed to the loudest one, the one who'd sworn the most elaborate oaths." Father shook his head and indicated the quietest man in the group, a ship captain who'd said little, but whose eyes had been sharp as a falcon's. "That man," Father said, "was the one who'd become our most reliable trading partner." And he was right. "How did Lord Hoster know?" Robb asked, his strategic mind engaged. "Experience, observation, understanding that honest men often speak plainly while liars embellish." Catelyn looked at her son. "The same skills that serve a lord in council serve him in trade, in war, in every aspect of rule. Learn to read people, Robb. Learn to see past what they say to what they mean." Ned stirred slightly, and Catelyn knew he was thinking of the lessons he'd learned in the Eyrie, under Jon Arryn's tutelage, of the political education that had served him well during the rebellion and poorly in its aftermath. Ned had always been too honest, too direct, for the subtle games that Southron lords played. It was one of the things she loved about him. It was also one of the things that worried her. "What about Aunt Lysa?" Sansa asked. "What was she like when you were girls together?" Catelyn's smile dimmed slightly. "Lysa, her little sister, now Lady of the Eyrie, wife to Jon Arryn, who was old enough to be their father. Catelyn had not seen Lysa in years, though letters passed between them irregularly, always filled with Lysa's complaints and anxieties. Lysa was delicate, Catelyn said, choosing her words with care. She took after our mother more than father. Very beautiful, very fragile. She was afraid of many things. Thunderstorms would send her running to our mother's chambers. She cried when father took us to see our troops drilling, said the sound of swords frightened her. Was she afraid of everything? Arya asked, with the disdain of a 9-year-old who prided herself on fearlessness. Not everything, Catelyn said gently. She loved birds, kept a whole aviary of songbirds in her chambers. She played the high harp beautifully, better than I ever did. She could sit for hours by the window, watching the rivers flow past, perfectly content with her own company. What Catelyn did not say, that Lysa's delicacy had masked a will as strong as their father's, that her sister's fears had never prevented her from pursuing what she wanted, that the match with Jon Arryn had been arranged partly to save Lysa from consequences of her own poor judgment. Some truths were not for children's ears. "And Uncle Edmure?" Bran asked. "Tell us about him." Catelyn laughed, the sound genuine and warm. "Edmure? Oh, where to begin? Your uncle was a constant trial to our father. Still is, I suspect. Though he's grown now, and serves as father's heir at Riverrun." "What did he do?" Arya asked eagerly, always interested in tales of mischief. "What didn't he do?" Catelyn shook her head, remembering. When Edmure was 10, he decided he needed to learn to swim properly. Not just paddle about in the shallows like a child, but truly swim like the rivermen who worked our boats. So he climbed to the top of Riverrun's watergate and jumped. Sansa gasped. Even Ned looked mildly alarmed. "The fall nearly killed him," Catelyn continued. "Father pulled him from the water himself, half drowned and terrified. I remember Mother weeping, Father shouting, Edmure coughing up river water and swearing he'd succeeded. He had swum, hadn't he, for at least a few moments before he started sinking." "Was he punished?" Robb asked. "Severely," Catelyn confirmed, "but it didn't cure his recklessness. The next moon, he borrowed father's best destrier to practice cavalry charges in the training yard. Edmure was 12 years old and had no business on a warhorse. The stallion threw him into a fence post, broke his arm in 2 places. Bran giggled, and even Jon Snow's usually solemn expression lightened with amusement. "Father despaired of him," Catelyn said, though her voice carried affection despite the exasperation. "Called Edmure the most stubborn child the gods had ever cursed a man with. But Mother always defended him, said his heart was brave even if his judgment was lacking, that courage could be tempered with wisdom, but cowardice could never be cured." "Did Uncle Edmure grow wise?" Sansa asked. Catelyn considered the question. Her brother was 30 now, experienced in war and politics, trusted by their father to hold Riverrun. Yet, in her mind's eye, she still saw the red-haired boy charging headlong into misadventure, certain his intentions would overcome any obstacle. "He grew wiser," she said diplomatically, "though I think Edmure will always lead with his heart, rather than his head. He believes in honor, in doing what's right regardless of consequences. It makes him a good man. Whether it makes him a good lord." She shrugged slightly. "Time will tell." She caught Ned's eye and saw understanding there. They both knew the danger of leading with heart over head, of letting honor override practical judgment. It was a very stark failing, as well as a tolly one. Your grandfather shaped each of us differently, Catelyn continued, steering toward the lesson she wanted to impart. He taught Edmure military strategy and leadership, prepared him to inherit. He taught Lysa courtly graces and music, prepared her for a good marriage. And he taught me. She paused, remembering her father's patient instruction in the solar, the hours spent learning to manage accounts, understand laws, navigate the complex web of loyalties and obligations that bound the Riverlands together. He taught me to be a lord's right hand, she said, to understand that a lady is not merely decorative, not simply a vessel for continuing the bloodline. A lady runs the household, manages resources, maintains alliances, serves as her Lord's counsellor and conscience. When Ned is away, I hold Winterfell. Not in name, perhaps, but in truth. Sansa absorbed this with visible surprise. Catelyn knew her daughter's romantic notions, the beautiful lady waiting for her knight, the passive recipient of devotion and protection. It was time Sansa began to understand that reality demanded more. Family, duty, honour, Catelyn repeated. Those 3 words governed everything Father taught us. Family comes first, always. The bonds of blood are sacred, inviolable. We protect our own above all else. Even when they're wrong? Arya asked with a child's directness. Even then, Catelyn said firmly, you can counsel them privately, argue with them, try to guide them to better paths. But to the outside world, you present a united front. A divided house falls. Father taught us that truth, young and often. She thought of Lysa in the Eyrie, of Edmure at Riverrun, of the bonds that stretched thin with distance and time, but never quite broke. Whatever their individual failings, they were Tully's. They would answer if she called. Duty comes second, Catelyn continued. The obligations we owe to our house, our bannermen, our small folk. A lord or lady is not free to pursue only personal desires. We serve something larger than ourselves. Robb nodded slowly, understanding this lesson already from Ned's teaching. And honour last, Catelyn finished, not because it matters least, but because it must be tempered by the other 2. Honour without regard for family leads to tragedy. Honour without regard for duty is mere vanity. She saw Ned's slight frown, knew he heard the implicit criticism of the Stark way. Honour above all, even when it cost everything. But she also saw him acknowledge the truth in her words. The Riverlands have taught me to be flexible, Catelyn said. Water flows around obstacles rather than breaking against them. We bend rather than break. We survive by adapting, by finding new paths when old ones are blocked. Is that why you're not more northern? Arya asked, though without malice, simple curiosity. Catelyn laughed softly. I suppose so. 14 years I've lived at Winterfell, and I still pray to the 7 rather than your old gods. I still find the godswood unsettling with its silent trees and carved faces. I still prefer the sound of running water to howling wind. But you belong here, Sansa said quickly, as if afraid her mother might doubt it. I do, Catelyn agreed, warmth filling her voice. Because I chose to belong here. When I married your father, I brought my Tully values north and learned to blend them with Stark traditions. I kept what served our house and adapted what didn't. That's what wives do. We bridge between houses, between regions, between different ways of seeing the world. She looked at Sansa directly. One day, you'll likely marry into another house, another kingdom. You'll bring Stark and Tully both with you. The northern strength and the Riverlands' flexibility. You'll need both to thrive. Sansa nodded seriously, and Catelyn felt a small satisfaction. Perhaps the lesson was landing. "I want you all to understand," Catelyn said, addressing the whole gathering now, "that strength comes in many forms. Your father's northern honor is strength, but so is the ability to negotiate, to compromise, to find solutions that don't require drawing swords. Both have their place. Both have their time." The fire had burned lower while she spoke, and servants moved quietly to add more wood. The flames leapt up again, casting fresh shadows across the ancient stones. "When I first came to Winterfell," Catelyn said quietly, "I was 17 years old, newly married to a man I barely knew, carrying a child conceived on our wedding night. I was far from home, in a land where everything was strange and hard, the cold bit deeper than I'd imagined possible. The people were reserved, slow to trust. The castle itself felt like a tomb, all stone and silence." She felt Ned's hand find hers, squeeze gently. "I wanted to run," she admitted. "Wanted to flee back to Riverrun, where water ran bright and people smiled easily, and the sun actually warmed the stones. But my father's teaching held me steady. Family, duty, honor. I had made my vows, borne my son, taken my place as Lady of Winterfell. So I learned," Catelyn continued. "Learned the names of every bannerman, every castle, every sworn sword. Learned to manage the household, to stretch supplies through long winters, to navigate the complex web of northern loyalties. Learned to see the beauty in this hard land, the way snow transforms everything, the strength in stone, the fierce loyalty of people who endure what would break softer folk. And now," she said, looking around at her children, "this is home. You are northern, all of you, as surely as you are Tully through me. But I hope I've taught you, am teaching you, that you can be both. You can honor your father's gods and mine. You can carry northern strength and Riverland's wisdom. You can be flexible and firm, diplomatic and direct, water and stone both." "Is that possible?" Robb asked, genuine curiosity in his voice. "Your proof it is," Catelyn said, smiling at her eldest son. "All of you are. You carry both bloodlines, both traditions, both ways of seeing the world. That makes you stronger, not weaker, if you learn to use both gifts wisely." The evening had grown late. Little Rickon was long asleep, and even Bran was fighting to keep his eyes open. But Catelyn felt satisfied with what she'd shared. A different kind of lesson than Ned's tales of honor and tragedy, but equally important. "Remember," she said as the gathering began to stir, preparing to retire, "the river finds its path not by force, but by persistence, by patience, by flowing around what cannot be moved through. That's wisdom too, as much as any northern saying about winter." She caught Arya's eye and held it. "Be fierce, my wild girl, but be wise as well. Learn when to flow and when to freeze, when to rush and when to pool quietly, gathering strength." Arya nodded slowly, and Catelyn hoped, prayed to her 7 gods, that the lesson would take root. The Starks of Winterfell rose, preparing to seek their beds. But, for one evening, they had touched something precious. The blending of north and south, stone and water, the wisdom that came from honoring both traditions, rather than choosing only one. Robb Stark shifted in his seat, feeling the weight of his father's and mother's story settle over him like a heavy cloak. At 14, he stood at the threshold between boyhood and manhood, old enough to understand the complexities his parents spoke of, young enough to still feel overwhelmed by them. Soon he would be Lord of Winterfell. The thought brought equal measures of pride and terror. "Father," he said, his voice steadier than he felt. "You've spoken of Uncle Brandon and Aunt Lyanna, of the rebellion and its cost. But I remember another visit, years ago, when King Robert came to Winterfell. I was very young, perhaps 6 or 7. Could you tell us of that time, of King Robert as he was?" Ned's expression shifted, something complicated passing across his features. Catelyn noticed it too. Robb saw his mother's hand tighten slightly on his father's arm. The king was coming again, would arrive within days now. The whole castle had been in upheaval, preparing for the royal visit. But that wasn't why Robb had asked. He wanted to understand his father's friendship with the king, wanted to glimpse the bond that had survived war and years of separation. "Robert," Ned said slowly, as if testing the name. "Yes, he visited once before, when you were small. You remember it?" "Some of it," Robb admitted. "I remember a huge man, bigger than anyone I'd ever seen. He lifted me clear off my feet, held me up, and laughed like thunder. I remember being terrified and thrilled all at once." A genuine smile touched Ned's face, brief but warm. "That sounds like Robert. He's never done anything by halves. Not fighting, not feasting, not friendship. Everything with Robert is larger, louder, more intense than with ordinary men." "Tell us how you met him," Sansa urged, her romantic heart clearly captivated by tales of the great king. Ned settled back, his gaze growing distant with memory. "I was 8 years old when father sent me to the Eyrie as Jon Arryn's ward. It's not uncommon. Great houses foster their sons with other lords to build alliances, teach them different ways. But at 8, I only knew I was being sent away from Winterfell, from everything I'd ever known." He paused, and Robb saw the echo of that lonely boy in his father's grey eyes. "The journey took weeks. When I finally arrived at the Eyrie, which sits high in the mountains of the Vale, carved into the stone itself, I was cold, exhausted, and certain I'd been exiled to the end of the world. Jon Arryn met me with kindness, but he was an old man even then, stern and formal. I spent my first evening in the High Hall, feeling utterly alone. And then?" Bran prompted, fully awake now, despite the late hour. "And then Robert Baratheon burst in like a summer storm," Ned said, and there was fondness in his voice despite everything. "He was a year older than me, already tall and broad-shouldered, even as a boy, black-haired, blue-eyed, loud as a war-horn. He took one look at me, this silent, sullen northern boy, and declared we'd be brothers." "Just like that?" Arya asked skeptically. "Just like that," Ned confirmed. "Robert decided things, and made them so through sheer force of will. He dragged me to the training yard the next morning, handed me a practice sword, and said, 'If we were to be brothers, we'd better learn to fight together.' I barely knew which end of the sword to hold properly. Brandon had been teaching me, but I was still clumsy, uncertain. Robert didn't care. He showed me basic forms, corrected my grip, then proceeded to beat me soundly in every bout we fought that day." Robb leaned forward. "Were you angry?" "Furious," Ned admitted. "I'd been raised on stark pride, taught that we were descended from the first men, from the kings of winter. Being thoroughly trounced by a southern boy stung my honor. But Robert just laughed, that great booming laugh of his, and said I'd get better, that we'd train together every day until I could give him a proper fight." "And did you?" Robb asked. "Eventually?" A ghost of a smile crossed Ned's face. "It took months, but yes. Robert was true to his word. We trained together daily, and he was a surprisingly good teacher when he wanted to be. He had natural talent with weapons, the kind of easy strength that made everything look simple. But he worked hard too, harder than people often remember. He wanted to be the best, and he pushed himself relentlessly. Catelyn spoke quietly. You loved him. It wasn't a question, and Ned didn't deny it. He was my brother, in all but blood. We grew up together in the Eyrie, spent 6 years under Jon Arryn's roof. Robert was. He was everything I wasn't. Bold where I was cautious, quick to laugh where I was serious, confident where I doubted. But we balanced each other. He taught me to be less rigid, to find joy in the moment. I taught him, tried to teach him, at least, to think before charging ahead. Did it work? Arya asked. Ned's expression darkened slightly. Sometimes, not often enough. Theon Greyjoy shifted in his seat, his attention focused with unusual intensity. Robb knew the Ironborn boy had his own complicated relationship with fosterage, with being raised by those who defeated his father in war. Listening to Ned speak of his time in the Vale must resonate strangely with Theon's experience. Jon Arryn was a great man, Ned continued, wise, measured, patient. He taught us history, law, the arts of governance. He showed us what it meant to rule justly, to put duty above desire, but he was old and distant in his way. Robert and I, we had each other. We were boys together, learned together, grew into men side by side. What was he like then? Robb asked. Before he was king? Magnificent, Ned said simply. In those days, Robert was the finest warrior I'd ever seen, strong as a bull, quick as a cat, despite his size. He could fight all day in the training yard and still have energy to feast and drink all night. He loved wine even then, loved women, loved songs and stories. But there was more to him than appetites. Ned paused, choosing his words carefully. Robert had a gift for inspiring loyalty. Men followed him, not just because he was strong, but because he made them believe in themselves. He saw the best in people, brought it out through sheer force of personality. When Robert smiled at you, clapped you on the shoulder, called you brother, you felt 10 feet tall. He sounds wonderful, Sansa said dreamily. He was, Ned agreed. And he was terrible too. His temper was legendary. He'd fly into rages over small slights, break things, shout loud enough to shake the rafters. Then an hour later, he'd have forgotten the whole incident, be laughing and joking as if nothing had happened. He never held grudges, but he also never really learned from his mistakes. Robb absorbed this, trying to reconcile the image of the magnificent young warrior with the heavy, wine-soaked king he'd glimpsed years ago during that previous visit. When did you learn about Aunt Lyanna's betrothal to him? Robb asked, then immediately wondered if he'd overstepped. The question seemed to hit his father like a blow. Ned was silent for a long moment. We were 15, he said finally. Word came from Winterfell. Father had negotiated the match. Robert was ecstatic. He'd seen Lyanna at a tourney the year before, been struck by her beauty, her spirit. He'd spoken of little else for months after. When he learned she'd be his bride, he declared it the happiest day of his life. And you? Catelyn asked gently. I was glad for him, Ned said. My best friend and my beloved sister. It seemed perfect. Lyanna would be queen in the Stormlands. Robert would have a wife who could match his passion. Jon Arryn said it was a strong political alliance joining North and Stormlands. His voice dropped. We were all fools. The bitterness in that last sentence startled Robb. His father rarely allowed such emotion to show. Why? Arya demanded. What was wrong with it? Ned seemed to struggle with the answer. Lyanna. She had concerns. She came to me once, before everything fell apart, and said Robert would never keep to one bed. She knew his reputation, knew he fathered bastards in every castle he visited. She asked me if I thought marriage would change him. What did you tell her? Robb asked quietly. I told her that Robert loved her, that love would make him faithful. Ned's voice was hollow now, filled with old regret. I was wrong. Robert loves easily, passionately, but not deeply. Not the way Lyanna needed to be loved. She saw that. I didn't want to. Catelyn's hand found Ned's again, and Robb saw his father grip it like a lifeline. The rebellion changed everything, Ned continued. When the Mad King murdered father and Brandon, when he demanded Jon Arryn send Robert and me south to be executed as well, we had no choice but to fight. Jon Arryn called his banners, Robert called his, I rode north to call Winterfell's. The realm split apart. You were only 19, Robb said, trying to imagine being thrust into war leadership at that age, just 5 years older than he was now. 18 when it started, Ned corrected. 19 when it ended. Robert was 19 as well, but he took to war like he'd been born for it. Every battle we fought, Robert was at the front, his great warhammer rising and falling, men rallying to his battle cry. He was glorious, terrifying, unstoppable. Ned's eyes had gone distant, seeing battlefields Robb had only heard about in songs and stories. At the Trident, Robert faced Prince Rhaegar Targaryen in single combat. The whole war hung on that moment. If Robert fell, the rebellion would likely collapse. If Rhaegar fell, the Targaryen cause was lost. Ned's voice dropped to barely a whisper. I've never forgotten watching them fight, two great warriors, the best of their generation, meeting in the shallows while armies watched. Robert's hammer caught Rhaegar's breastplate, caved it in, drove the rubies from his armor into the river. The prince fell, and the war was won. But Aunt Lyanna still died, Arya said bluntly. Yes. The single word carried oceans of grief. Robert won his war, lost his love, and in losing her, lost something essential in himself. The man who rode to the Trident was not quite the same man who rode away from it. Robb wanted to ask about the Tower of Joy, about the mysterious circumstances of Lyanna's death, but something in his father's expression warned against it. Some doors remained closed, even in this evening of storytelling. When Robert visited Winterfell that time, you remember, Ned said, steering towards safer ground. He was already king, already married to Cersei Lannister in a political match that satisfied everyone except Robert himself. He'd grown heavier, drank more, fought less. But for a few days, while we hunted and feasted and remembered our youth, a sad smile crossed Ned's face. For a few days, I had my brother back, the Robert I'd grown up with before crowns and thrones and the weight of ruling changed him. Is that why you're preparing so carefully for his arrival now? Robb asked. Because you want those days back. I'm preparing carefully, Ned said, because Robert is the king, and Winterfell owes him proper hospitality. But yes, part of me hopes we might recapture something of what we had. Probably foolish. Not foolish, Catelyn said softly. Human. Theon finally spoke, his voice carrying an edge Robb recognized as carefully controlled anger. You speak of fosterage as if it's a gift, my lord, an honor, but it's also a chain, isn't it? A way to ensure loyalty through held hostages. The gathering went very quiet. Ned turned to look at Theon fully, and Robb saw his father measuring his response. Yes, Ned said finally, with the honesty that characterized him. Fosterage serves many purposes. It builds bonds, teaches different ways, creates alliances. But it also ensures good behavior from the fostering house. You are right to name it a chain, Theon. I won't insult you by denying the truth. Yet you loved Robert, Theon pressed. Your captor's surrogate son became your brother. How? Jon Arryn was not my captor, Ned said quietly. He was my teacher, my guardian, my second father in many ways. He treated me with kindness and respect. He gave me no cause to hate him. He paused. Your situation is different. I understand that. Your father rebelled, lost, and you came to Winterfell as surety for his future behavior. It was not your choice. You have every right to resent it. Theon looked away, jaw tight. But I have tried, Ned continued, to treat you as I would my own sons, to teach you, train you, prepare you for whatever future awaits. Not because I want your gratitude, but because it's the only honorable way I know to handle an inherently difficult situation. The Ironborn boy nodded stiffly, offering no words, but acknowledging the truth of what Ned said. Robb felt the weight of the moment, his father's complicated history with fosterage, with friendship born from political necessity, with bonds that transcended their origins. One day, Robb might need to forge such bonds himself, might need to navigate the treacherous waters between genuine affection and political calculation. I hope King Robert's visit goes well, Robb said, meaning it. I hope you find your friend again, father, even if only for a little while. As do I, Ned said, though I suspect we'll both find we've changed too much, walked too far down different paths. Robert is king now, with a king's burdens and a king's blindnesses, and he gestured around Winterfell's ancient hall. I'm Lord of Winterfell, with responsibilities I never wanted, but now cannot set aside. You were both shaped by war, Catelyn observed, by loss and duty and the weight of choices made when you were barely more than boys. Perhaps that's enough common ground to build on. Perhaps, Ned agreed, though he sounded doubtful. The fire had burned low again, and true night had settled over Winterfell. The wind howled outside, carrying the first hints of snow. Winter was coming indeed, and with it the king and all his court, bringing change and chaos to their ordered northern life. Come, Catelyn said, rising gracefully. It grows late, and we have more stories yet to share. But perhaps we should rest now. Let these settle before we continue. The children stirred, stretching stiff limbs. Robb stood, offering his hand to help Sansa up, watching as Arya bounded to her feet with her usual graceless energy. Bran yawned hugely, and little Rickon had to be carried, still sleeping, from the hall. But Robb lingered a moment, watching his father stare into the dying fire. Ned Stark looked older tonight, worn by memory and approaching obligation. The stories had cost him something, excavating old griefs, examining old friendships with the clear eyes of experience. Father, Robb said quietly, thank you for sharing these things with us. I know it's not easy. Ned looked up, surprise flickering across his features. Then he smiled, a real smile, warm and genuine. You're growing into a good man, Robb. You'll make a fine Lord of Winterfell when the time comes. The praise warmed Robb more than the fire ever could. He nodded, not trusting his voice, and followed his siblings from the hall. Behind him, his parents remained by the hearth, speaking in low voices about kings and duties and the uncertain future. But for Robb, the evening had given him something precious, a deeper understanding of the man his father was, the bonds that had shaped him, the friendships that had survived war and distance and time's relentless erosion. One day, Robb knew, he would forge his own such bonds, would make his own choices between honor and expedience, duty and desire, the rigid northern way and the more flexible southern approach. The stories his parents had shared tonight would guide him then, would remind him that even the greatest men struggled with these questions, made mistakes, carried regrets. The Starks of Winterfell walked their separate ways to bed, each carrying the weight of history and the hope of tomorrow. Outside, the first snow began to fall, silent and inexorable, covering the ancient stones in white. Winter was coming, but for tonight, in the warmth of family and shared memory, it could wait. The following evening, the family gathered once more before the great hearth. The first snow had continued through the day, light but persistent, dusting the castle walls and yards with white. Now, as darkness fell early, as it always did in autumn's waning days, Winterfell seemed to draw inward, becoming a fortress of warmth and light against the encroaching cold. Bran Stark could barely contain his excitement. All day he'd been thinking about the stories, about the fragments of history and legend that wove through his family's past. His father had promised more tales tonight, and Bran had specific requests. He wanted to hear about the Wall, that massive edifice of ice and magic that marked the northern boundary of the Seven Kingdoms. He wanted to hear about the lands beyond, about wildlings and giants, and the strange, terrible things that old Nan whispered about when she thought the adults weren't listening. Old Nan should join us tonight, Bran announced as the family assembled. She knows the best stories, the really old ones from the age of heroes and before. Ned looked at Catelyn, who nodded slightly. "Very well," Ned said. "Someone fetch old Nan. If we're to speak of the Wall and the far north, we should have the keeper of such tales present." Old Nan arrived slowly, leaning heavily on her stick, guided by one of the younger servants. She was ancient beyond reckoning. Some said she'd been old when Ned's grandfather was a boy, though that seemed impossible. Her face was a maze of wrinkles, her hands gnarled like tree roots, but her eyes remained sharp and bright as a bird's. "Lord Stark," she croaked, settling into a cushioned chair near the fire. "You want old stories, then? Tales to frighten children and remind men that winter is more than cold?" "I want the truth," Ned said simply, "or as close to truth as the tales preserve. My children should understand what lies north of Winterfell, what the Wall was built to contain." Old Nan cackled softly. "Truth and tales, all mixed together after so many years. Who can say where one ends and the other begins?" She fixed her bright eyes on Bran. "But you want to hear, young lordling? Want to know about the others and the long night?" Bran nodded eagerly, though he felt a shiver run down his spine at the mention of the others. Old Nan had told him fragments before, terrifying whispers of creatures from beyond the world, bringing cold and death, but never the full tale. "The Wall first," Ned interjected firmly. "Before we speak of what it was built against, let's speak of the Wall itself. Old Nan, tell them of Brandon the Builder." The ancient woman settled back, her eyes going distant, as they always did when she reached into the deep well of memory and legend that filled her mind. "Brandon the Builder," she began, her voice taking on the rhythmic quality of a tale told countless times across countless years. "Brandon Stark, who lived in the Age of Heroes, 8,000 years ago. or 4,000, if you believe the maesters with their books and chains. Brandon, who raised Winterfell, or so the stories say. Brandon, who helped build Storm's End for his friend. Brandon, who raised the wall. How, Arya demanded, how could one man build something so huge? He didn't build it alone, child, old Nan replied. Some say giants helped him. For there were giants in those days, great lumbering creatures twice the height of a man. Some say the children of the forest helped with their earth magic, their songs that could shape stone and ice. Some say there was older magic still, darker powers that Brandon called upon. What kind of magic? Bran asked, leaning so far forward he nearly fell from his seat. The old kind, old Nan said mysteriously, the kind that requires sacrifice, the kind that binds power into walls and foundations, that makes stone remember and ice endure. But those are dangerous tales, not for— Tell us anyway, Arya interrupted. We're not babies. Old Nan looked at Ned, who nodded slowly. Tell them, he said. But make clear what is history and what is legend. History and legend, old Nan muttered, like oil and water in the same cup, impossible to separate after so long. But she continued anyway. The wall stands 700 feet high, runs from the Bay of Seals to the gorge, 300 miles of ice and old magic. Men of the Night's Watch have manned it for 8,000 years, standing guard against what lies beyond. I'm going to take the black, Jon Snow said suddenly, from his place at the edge of the gathering. It was the first time he'd spoken this evening, and every eye turned to him. I've decided. I'll join the Night's Watch, serve at the wall. The pronouncement fell like a stone into still water, sending ripples of reaction through the family. Catelyn's lips thinned. She had never hidden her discomfort with Jon's presence, and the thought of him leaving likely brought relief. Robb looked troubled, losing a brother he'd grown up beside. Arya's face crumpled with dismay, but it was Ned's reaction that mattered most. He studied Jon for a long moment, his grey eyes unreadable. The Night's Watch, Ned said slowly, is an ancient and honourable institution. To serve the realm, to guard against darkness, to stand the shield that protects the kingdoms of men. These are noble purposes. He paused. But it is also a lifetime vow, Jon. Once taken, there is no leaving, no marriage, no children, no lands or titles. You forsake all claims, all futures except the one you choose at the wall. I know, Jon said quietly. I've thought about it. What else is there for me? I'm a bastard. I can't inherit, can't marry well, can't build a house or legacy. But at the wall, I could be something, could serve something greater than myself. The pain in Ned's expression was visible, quickly masked, but present. Robb recognized it, his father struggling between pride in Jon's choice and sorrow at losing another piece of family. We'll speak of it more, in private, Ned said. But if this is truly your path, I'll not stand in your way. The wall has always welcomed Stark blood. Catelyn said nothing, though her expression spoke volumes. Sansa looked confused, not understanding why anyone would choose such a hard life. But Arya looked devastated, tears threatening in her grey eyes. You can't go, she whispered. Jon, you can't leave. Jon met his half-sister's gaze with obvious affection. Not yet, little sister. I've time still. Old Nan cleared her throat, reclaiming attention. The boy speaks of serving at the wall. Well then, let him hear what service means. Let him understand what he's choosing. She turned her bird-bright eyes on Jon. The Night's Watch was founded in the Age of Heroes, in the dark years after the Long Night. The others had come from the frozen lands beyond the world, bringing winter that lasted a generation. They killed all they touched, raised the dead to fight as their servants. Whites, the old tales call, them corpses with blue eyes and cold hands. Rickon whimpered softly, and Catelyn pulled him closer. The first men and the children of the forest fought them, old Nan continued relentlessly. Fought for years in darkness and snow and cold beyond imagining. Many heroes rose in those years. The last hero who wandered the wastes, Azor Ahai, who forged the great sword Lightbringer, others whose names are lost. And when finally the others were driven back, when winter broke at last and spring returned, the survivors swore an oath. "What oath?" Bran asked. "The oath that becomes the night's watch," old Nan replied. "To stand guard forever, to watch for the others' return, to hold the wall against the darkness beyond. Night gathers, and now my watch begins." That's how it starts. Words that have been spoken by thousands of men across thousands of years. "But the others are just stories," Sansa said uncertainly. "Aren't they? Things to frighten children?" Ned spoke before old Nan could respond. "The masters say the others are legend, exaggerations born from folk memory of harsh winters and desperate times. They point out that no one has seen an other in 8,000 years, that the wildlings beyond the wall are the only real threat." "But you don't believe that," Robb said, reading something in his father's tone. "I believe," Ned said carefully, "that the wall was built for a reason, that the Night's Watch has stood for 8,000 years for a purpose. Whether that purpose is defending against others or wildlings, or simply maintaining order in the far north." He shrugged. "I am not certain, but I know the Watch matters. I know their service is real, even if the ancient enemy is not." "The enemy is real," old Nan said flatly. "I've lived long enough to know that some stories are true, even if men prefer to forget them. The others will come again. They always do. Winter is coming. Not just the season, but the true winter, the long darkness. And when it comes, the wall and the watch will be all that stands between the realms of men and cold eternal." Silence fell, heavy and oppressive. Even the fire seemed to burn lower, as if old Nan's words had drawn warmth from the very air. "Tell us about the Night's King," Bran urged, wanting to hear the story he'd heard before in fragments, but never complete. Old Nan's face grew grimmer still. "Ah, that's a dark tale, that is. The Night's King was the 13th Lord Commander of the Night's Watch, or so the stories say. A warrior of the first men who found a woman in the woods beyond the wall. A woman with skin white as snow and eyes blue as ice. An other, some say, or something close to it." "He loved her?" Sansa asked, her romantic heart engaged despite her fear. "Loved or was ensorcelled," old Nan replied. "Who can say? He brought her back to the Night Fort, the oldest castle on the wall, long abandoned now, and declared himself king. The Night's King, he called himself, and his corpse queen ruled beside him. For 13 years they held the Night Fort, performing dark rites, making sacrifices, turning the watch into something twisted and terrible." "What happened to him?" Arya demanded. "The Stark of Winterfell and the King beyond the wall joined forces," old Nan said. "Marched on the Night Fort together, ended the Night's King's reign. They killed him and his queen both, tore down what he'd built, cleansed the Night Fort with fire and prayer. And afterward they scrubbed his name from the records. The Night's King became just the Night's King. No true name, no history, nothing but a warning. Some say," she added, her voice dropping to a whisper, that he was a Stark himself. A younger son, perhaps, or a bastard. Some say his name was Brandon, like so many Starks before and since. Bran felt ice in his belly at that. The Night's King might have been a Stark, might have carried his own name. Stories, Ned said firmly. Old Nan tells the tales as they were told to her, but we must remember they are tales. The Night's Watch has stood for 8,000 years without another Night's King. The Night Fort stands empty because it's ancient and crumbling, not cursed. The others, if they ever existed, haven't troubled the Watch in all of recorded history. But you believe something is out there, Jon said. It wasn't a question. Ned met his bastard son's eyes. I believe the North remembers things the South has forgotten. I believe winter is more than cold and snow. I believe the Wall serves a purpose beyond keeping out raiders and wildlings. He paused. And I believe the Night's Watch deserves our respect and support, regardless of whether their ancient enemy is real or legend. Tell them about the wildlings, Catelyn interjected, perhaps wanting to steer toward more concrete dangers. If Jon is truly considering the Watch, he should understand what he'll actually face. Old Nan nodded. The free folk, they call themselves. Wildlings. We call them south of the Wall. They're first men like us, like the North has always been. But they never knelt to the kings of winter, never accepted rule or law or order. They live beyond the Wall, in scattered clans and tribes, raiding each other and sometimes raiding south when they can slip through. Why don't they just live in peace? Sansa asked. If they're people like us. Because winter is harsher beyond the Wall, Ned explained. The land is poorer, the cold deeper, the game scarcer. When winter comes, the free folk either raid south for supplies or die. It's that simple, that brutal. The Watch exists partly to prevent those raids, to keep the North from being overrun when desperation drives the wildlings south in force. Are they evil? Bran asked. They're people, Ned said. Hard people, violent people, but people nonetheless. They have their own laws, their own customs, their own gods. The old gods, like the North once worshipped exclusively. Some are raiders and killers. Others are simply trying to survive in a land that shows no mercy. I've heard stories, Theon spoke up, of wildling women warriors. Spearwives, they're called. Women who fight alongside their men, raid and kill without hesitation. True enough, Ned confirmed. The free folk don't share our customs regarding women and war. If a woman can fight, she fights. If she's strong enough to lead, she leads. They have no knights, no chivalry, no courtly graces, just survival. Arya's eyes gleamed with interest, and Catelyn sighed quietly. There are darker things beyond the Wall, Old Nan said, not willing to let the conversation remain entirely practical. Giants, yes, they're real, though rare and getting rarer. Creatures of snow and ice that hunt in the darkness. The children of the forest once lived there, though none have been seen in thousands of years. And in the furthest reaches, in the lands of always winter where even wildlings fear to go. She let the sentence hang, unfinished but heavy with implication. The others, Bran whispered. If they exist, Old Nan agreed, if the stories are true, if winter is truly coming as the old words warn. Jon shifted in his seat, his expression troubled. If I join the Watch, he said slowly, if I take the black and stand the Wall, what am I really guarding against? Old evils that might be myth, desperate wildlings trying to survive. What does the Watch actually do? They endure, Ned said simply. They stand their posts through winter storms and summer heat. They patrol the wall's length, man the castles, venture beyond to track wildling movements. They take criminals and bastards and younger sons, and they forge them into something honourable, something that serves. He looked at Jon directly. The Night's Watch may face no others, may fight no dark lords or corpse queens, but they hold the border, maintain order, protect the north from chaos beyond. That's service enough for any man. And if the old tales are true, Jon asked, if something darker is coming, then, Ned said quietly, the Watch will be the first to know, the first to stand against it, the first to fall, perhaps, but also the first to fight. There's honour in that, Jon. Great honour. The fire crackled, and outside the wind howled like wolves, or like the ghosts of ancient warriors, calling across the centuries for men brave or foolish enough to take up their watch. Bran looked at his half-brother, seeing Jon in a new light. Soon he would leave, would ride north to Castle Black and take vows that would bind him forever, would stand on that massive wall of ice and magic, looking out at the darkness beyond, wondering what might look back. I want to see it, Bran announced suddenly. The wall. Before Jon goes, I want to see it with my own eyes. One day, Ned promised. When you're older, we'll ride north together. I'll show you Castle Black, introduce you to the Lord Commander, let you walk the wall's length and see the lands beyond. But not yet. You're too young still. I'm not too young, Bran protested, though without much hope. You are, Catelyn said firmly. The wall is weeks away, in the hardest part of the north. When winter comes, it's no place for a 7-year-old boy. Bran subsided, disappointed but knowing argument was futile. Old Nan cleared her throat. The young lord wants to hear about the wall and what lies beyond. Well, I've told what I know, the legends passed down, the warnings preserved. Believe them or don't, but remember them. When winter comes, when the cold settles deep and the snow falls for months without end, remember that the north has faced worse, has survived worse. Because we remember, because we prepare, because we never forget that winter is coming. She stood, slowly, painfully. Now this old woman needs her bed. The young can sit up telling stories all night, but age requires rest. Ned rose to help her, but she waved him off irritably. I can walk, my lord. I'm old, not dead. She shuffled toward the door, then paused and looked back. Though some nights, in the deep winter, I wonder if there's much difference. With that cheerful thought, she departed, leaving the family to contemplate her words. The evening had grown late, the fire burning low once more. The younger children were yawning, even Arya fighting to keep her eyes open. But the spell of old Nan's storytelling lingered, the sense of ancient threats and eternal vigilance, of walls built against darkness, and men sworn to stand guard forever. Come, Catelyn said gently, to bed, all of you. We've had enough of terrors and legends for one night. As the children dispersed, Jon lingered, and Ned did too. Robb watched them speak quietly by the dying fire, father and bastard son discussing the choice that would shape Jon's entire future. The choice to leave family and home, to stand the wall against whatever might come. Others or wildlings, legend or reality, darkness or merely cold. Robb climbed the stairs to his chamber, his mind full of stories and warnings. He was heir to Winterfell, would one day rule the north. Would he need to defend against ancient evils risen from legend, or merely the prosaic threats of ambitious neighbours and harsh winters? Either way, he thought, the North would stand. The Starks would endure. They always had. Winter was coming. But the wall stood, and the watch kept their vigil, and Winterfell remained strong. For tonight, that was enough. The third evening of storytelling arrived, with a deepening cold that seemed to seep through Winterfell's ancient stones, despite the hot springs that ran beneath. The snow had continued intermittently throughout the day, and now a white blanket covered the castle yards and rooftops, transforming the grey fortress into something almost ethereal in the fading light. Arya Stark had been restless all day, her mind churning with the stories she'd heard, of Aunt Lyanna, who rode like a Northman and defied expectations, of wildling, spearwives who fought alongside their men, of ancient mysteries and powers that the masters dismissed, but the old tales preserved. She felt something stirring in her blood, a wildness that the proper lessons of sceptres and ladies could not contain. Now, as the family gathered once more before the great hearth, Arya found she could not sit still. She perched on the edge of her seat, one leg tucked under her, the other swinging restlessly. Her sceptre would have scolded her for the unladylike posture, but her mother merely sighed and let it pass. These evenings were different, less formal, a respite from the constant pressure to be something Arya was not. "Father," she said, unable to contain herself longer, "tell us about the direwolves, the real ones, not just the sigil. Old Nan says the Starks used to ride them into battle, that the kings of winter had direwolves as big as horses. Is that true?" Ned looked at his wild daughter with an expression that mingled amusement and something deeper, recognition, perhaps, of seeing his lost sister's spirit alive in this fierce child. "Direwolves," he said slowly, "are real, though rare. They live in the deep forests beyond the wall, hunt in packs, grow larger than common wolves. In the Age of Heroes, they were more common. The first men who settled the north lived alongside them, and the Starks. Yes, the Starks had a special bond with them." "Magic?" Bran asked eagerly. "The old stories say so," Ned replied. "They speak of skin changers and wargs, people who could enter the minds of animals, see through their eyes, control their actions. The Starks were said to have this gift more than most, particularly with wolves. Brandon the Builder supposedly had a great grey direwolf that followed him like a shadow. The king who knelt had 3 direwolves that guarded his hall. Jon Stark, the king in the north, during the long night, rode a direwolf white as snow into battle against the others." "But those are just stories," Sansa said uncertainly. "Aren't they? People can't really enter animals' minds." Ned's expression grew carefully neutral, the look he wore when discussing matters that touched on the old magic, the mysteries that Meisters dismissed, but Northmen whispered about in the Godswood's shadow. "The Meisters say such things are impossible," he said. "That skin changing is superstition, that the bond between Starks and wolves is merely symbolic, a powerful sigil chosen by our ancestors, nothing more." "But you don't believe that," Arya said, reading the reservation in her father's voice. "I believe," Ned said slowly, choosing each word with care, "that the North remembers things the South has forgotten. I believe the first men knew secrets that have been lost over the long centuries. I believe that magic, if it ever existed, was real and powerful and dangerous." He paused, looking at each of his children in turn, even Jon, even Theon, gathering them all into the circle of this telling. "The Starks carry the blood of the first men," Ned continued. We've held Winterfell for 8,000 years, worshipped the old gods when the Andals brought their seven across the narrow sea, maintained traditions that seem strange to Southron eyes. We keep the godswood sacred. We execute men ourselves, rather than delegating to headsmen. We bury our dead in the crypts beneath Winterfell, set stone wolves at their feet, preserve their memory in darkness. Why? Robb asked. Why maintain these old ways when most of the realm has moved beyond them? Because we are the North, Ned said simply. Because someone must remember. Because the old ways, the old knowledge, the old truths, these things matter, even if we no longer fully understand why they matter. Catelyn shifted slightly, uncomfortable as she always was when discussion turned to the old gods and their mysteries. She was a woman of the Seven, raised in the faith, and though she had lived at Winterfell for 14 years, the godswood still unsettled her with its ancient weirwood and carved face, its pools of dark water and rustling leaves that seemed to whisper secrets. "Tell us about the weirwoods," Arya demanded. "About the faces carved in them, about the children of the forest who made them. Old Nan says the trees have eyes, that the old gods watch through them." "The children of the forest," Ned said, his voice taking on the quality of ancient history, "were the first people in Westeros. They lived here for thousands of years before the first men came, small people, no taller than children, even when grown, with nut-brown skin and large eyes. They were the singers of songs, the dancers in the deep woods. They worshipped the old gods through the weirwood trees, carved faces in the white bark so the gods could watch over them." "What happened to them?" Bran asked. "The first men came," Ned replied. "Crossed the land bridge from Essos with bronze swords and axes, began cutting down the weirwoods, clearing the forests. The children fought back with their earth magic, their songs that could shatter stone and raise water. For generations, war raged between the first men and the children of the forest." He gestured toward the window, though darkness had fallen and nothing could be seen beyond. Out there, on the Isle of Faces in the God's Eye Lake, the war finally ended. The first men and the children made a pact, the pact of the Isle of Faces. The first men would take the open lands, but leave the deep forests to the children. They would stop cutting the weirwoods, would adopt the old gods as their own, would live in peace with those who had come before. "And it worked?" Sansa asked. "For thousands of years, yes," Ned confirmed. "The first men and the children lived side by side. The children taught the first men their magic, green-seeing, skin-changing, the songs of earth and stone. In return, the first men protected the forests, honored the old gods, carved new faces in the weirwoods so the watching would continue." "But the children are gone now," Arya said, a note of loss in her voice. "Gone south of the wall, at least," Ned agreed. "When the Andals invaded 6,000 years ago, bringing the faith of the Seven and iron swords, they had no pact with the children. They cut down the weirwoods wherever they found them, drove the children deeper into the forests, killed or scattered those who remained. In the south, the children vanished entirely. Only in the north, where the Andals never fully conquered, did the old ways survive." "Are there still children of the forest beyond the wall?" Bran asked hopefully. "The wildlings speak of them," Ned said, "claim to have seen them in the deepest forests, the most remote valleys. Whether those tales are true, or simply legends preserved," he shrugged, "I cannot say. No one south of the wall has seen a child of the forest in living memory. But the weirwoods remain," Arya said, thinking of the heart tree in Winterfell's godswood, its bone-white bark and blood-red leaves, the face carved into its trunk with eyes that seemed to follow her when she passed. The weirwoods remain, Ned confirmed, and through them, perhaps, the old gods still watch. Or perhaps they're simply trees, and the faces are merely carvings, and all the magic has faded from the world. He smiled slightly. The masters would certainly prefer the latter explanation. "What do you believe, Father?" Robb asked seriously. Ned was silent for a long moment, staring into the fire as if seeking answers in the flames. When he spoke, his voice was quiet, reflective. "I believe that when I stand before the heart tree, when I pray to the old gods as my fathers have done for 8,000 years, I feel something. A presence, a watching, an awareness that goes beyond mere stone and wood. Whether that's the gods themselves, or simply the weight of history, the accumulated prayers of countless Starks." He shook his head. "I don't know, but I feel it nonetheless." Catelyn reached over and took his hand, and Arya saw the gesture, her mother offering comfort for something she could not fully understand or share. The old gods were not her gods. The godswood was not her place of peace. But she loved a man who held those mysteries sacred, and she respected what she could not embrace. "The direwolves," Arya said, circling back to her original question with the determination of a hunter tracking prey. "The bond between Starks and wolves. Is it real? Could I... She couldn't quite articulate what she was asking, but Ned seemed to understand. "I don't know," he said honestly. "The stories speak of it. Old Nan swears it's true, but I've never seen it in my lifetime, never known a Stark who could enter a wolf's mind or see through its eyes. If the gift exists, it's become rare. Or perhaps it never existed at all, and the stories exaggerated natural affinity into something more." Disappointment flickered across Arya's face, quickly hidden, but present. However, Ned continued, and something in his tone made everyone lean forward. "I will say this. There is power in blood, in lineage, in the ancient connections between families and the land they've held for millennia. The Starks are part of the North in ways that go deeper than politics or ownership. We are woven into this place, and it into us." He stood abruptly. "Come, all of you who are willing. I would take you to the godswood, show you the heart tree by night, let you feel what I feel, understand what I'm speaking of." Catelyn's expression showed concern. "Ned, it's full dark outside. The children will be safe," Ned assured her. "We're not leaving Winterfell's walls, just walking to the godswood." He looked at his wife. "You need not come if you'd prefer not to." Catelyn hesitated, then stood. "No. If you're taking them, I'll come as well." The younger children scrambled up eagerly. Bran was practically bouncing with excitement. Arya felt her heart racing. The godswood at night was forbidden usually, deemed too dangerous in darkness. But their father was offering to show them, to share something sacred. Even Sansa rose, though she looked uncertain. Robb stood without hesitation, as did Jon. Theon followed more slowly, his expression unreadable. The Ironborn had their own gods, the drowned god of the deep waters, and little use for the old gods of earth and tree. Servants brought heavy cloaks, fur-lined and warm. Ned wrapped each child carefully, even pulled a thick woolen cloak around Catelyn's shoulders himself. Then he took up a torch from the wall, and the small procession moved from the warmth of the great hall into Winterfell's cold night. The snow had stopped, but several inches had fallen, crunching beneath their boots as they walked. The castle yard was transformed, walls and buildings softened by white, sharp edges blurred, the whole world reduced to shades of grey and black and white. Above, the stars burned cold and distant, and Arya could see her breath misting in the frozen air. They passed the covered bridge, moved beyond the inner ward toward the older parts of Winterfell. Here the stones were more ancient, weathered by time and northern winters beyond counting. The godswood stood at Winterfell's heart, a remnant of the vast forest that had once covered all the north before men came with their axes and ambitions. The ironwood gate stood open. It was never locked, for the godswood was sacred space, open to any who sought the old god's peace. Ned led them through, and the world changed. Inside the godswood, the snow lay pristine and undisturbed. The 3 acres of forest seemed vast in the darkness, the trees pressing close, their branches bare of leaves but dense enough to create a canopy overhead. The torch Ned carried cast dancing shadows that made the trees seem alive, reaching, aware. "Stay together," Ned instructed quietly. "The paths are clear, but darkness makes everything strange." They moved, in single file along the packed earth path, boots crunching softly in the snow. Around them, the forest breathed, wind sighing through branches, small animals rustling in the underbrush, the distant hoot of an owl. Arya felt the wildness of it, the ancient quality that made the godswood different from any other place in Winterfell. The path opened into a clearing, and there stood the heart tree. The weirwood rose massive and pale, its bone-white bark luminous even in torchlight. Blood-red leaves rustled overhead, and the face carved into the trunk seemed to watch them with eyes that wept, slow red sap like tears. The pool at the tree's base was black as night, perfectly still, reflecting the weirwood's ghostly pallor. Arya felt her breath catch. She'd seen the heart tree before, of course, had played in the godswood countless times during daylight. But at night, with torch shadows dancing and the wind whispering through the leaves, it became something else, something older, stranger, more powerful than she'd ever recognized. "The heart tree of Winterfell," Ned said quietly, his voice barely above a whisper. "Planted by the first men thousands of years ago. Every castle in the north once had a godswood, a heart tree, a place where the old gods could watch. Many are gone now, cut down when families converted to the Seven or simply abandoned the old ways. But Winterfell's remains." He moved closer to the tree, laid his hand against the white bark. "When I need guidance, when I face decisions that weigh too heavy, I come here. I stand before the heart tree and speak my troubles to the old gods. And sometimes, not always, but sometimes, I find clarity. Answers rise from within me, as if the gods speak through my own thoughts." "Or perhaps," Catelyn said gently, "you simply give yourself time to think, to listen to your own wisdom." "Perhaps," Ned agreed without rancor. "Does it matter? If prayer focuses the mind, grants peace, provides clarity, isn't that answer enough?" Arya moved closer to the tree, drawn by something she couldn't name. The carved face watched her approach with its weeping red eyes. She reached out slowly, hesitantly, and touched the bark. It was warm. That shocked her. She'd expected cold, the chill of winter and snow. But the weirwood was warm beneath her palm, almost like touching living flesh, and she felt something. A thrumming, like a heartbeat deep within the wood, a sense of vast age, of watching, of knowing. "Do you feel it?" Ned asked softly, watching his daughter. Yes, Arya whispered. It's alive. Really alive. Not just tree alive. It's... She couldn't find words for what she felt. Power, perhaps. Awareness. A presence that had watched this place for thousands of years. That knew every Stark who'd come before. That remembered things the histories had forgotten. One by one, the others approached. Robb touched the bark reverently, his expression showing wonder. Bran placed both small hands against the trunk, closing his eyes as if trying to hear something only he could sense. Even Jon stepped forward, bastard though he was, and laid his palm against the ancient wood. Sansa hung back, uncertain, and Theon stood well away, clearly uncomfortable in this place of foreign gods and old magic. The Starks have prayed here for 8,000 years, Ned said. Every lord, every lady, every child who lived in these halls has stood where we stand now, touched this tree, sought the gods' guidance. Brandon the Builder touched this bark, the king who knelt, the kings of winter who held the north against all enemies. My father, my brother, my sister, all of them stood here, prayed here, found whatever peace or strength they needed. He looked at his children, and Arya saw emotion raw on his face. One day, when I'm gone, when I lie in the crypts with stone wolves at my feet, you'll come here without me, Ned said. You'll face your own troubles, make your own choices, seek your own answers. And this tree will still stand, the old gods will still watch, the North will still remember. We'll remember too, Robb said quietly. We'll remember you, Father. Remember these nights, these stories, these lessons. Ned smiled, though his eyes gleamed with moisture that might have been tears or merely the cold. That's all any man can hope for, to be remembered, to leave something of value behind, to know that his children will carry forward what he's tried to teach. Arya pressed her palm harder against the weirwood, feeling that strange warmth, that pulse of ancient life. She thought of Aunt Lyanna, who must have touched this same bark, of Uncle Brandon, of all the Starks who'd come before. Their blood ran in her veins, their history lived in her bones. She was part of something vast and old and enduring. The wind picked up, rushing through the godswood with a sound almost like voices, whispering, warning, or perhaps welcoming. The red leaves of the weirwood rustled and sighed, and the carved face seemed to shift in the dancing torchlight, its expression changing from sorrow to wisdom, to something that might have been approval. The old gods see us, Ned said softly. Through this tree, through all the weirwoods that still stand, they watch over the north. They remember, they endure, and they wait. For winter, for darkness, for the moment when the realm will need the old powers once again. Do you think that time is coming? Jon asked, his voice barely audible. Ned was silent for a long moment, his hand resting on the weirwood's bark, his eyes distant, as if seeing futures or pasts that remained hidden from the rest. I think, he said finally, that winter is always coming, that darkness is always waiting, and that the North, the Starks, the old gods and old ways, we exist to stand ready, to remember when others forget, to hold fast when others would flee. He turned to face them all, his expression fierce in the torchlight. You are Starks. You carry the blood of the first men, the legacy of 8,000 years, the weight of all those who came before. That is both gift and burden. Honor it, remember it. Let it make you strong when strength is needed. Arya felt those words sink deep, settle into her bones, like the warmth from the weirwood. She was a Stark. She was part of this ancient line, this enduring house. Whatever happened, wherever life took her, that truth would remain. They stood together in the godswood for a while longer, family gathered beneath the watching weirwood, united in blood and history and the silent presence of gods older than the Seven Kingdoms themselves. The cold pressed close, but they had each other's warmth, had the strange heat that radiated from the heart tree, had the knowledge that they belonged to something greater than themselves. Finally, Ned stirred. "Come, back to the hall, to warmth and rest. The old gods will keep their watch whether we stand here or not." They filed out of the godswood slowly, reluctantly, each casting a final glance back at the pale weirwood with its watching face. Arya was last to leave, her hand trailing along the bark until distance forced her to release it. As they crossed back into Winterfell's familiar yards, back toward the great hall's welcoming light and warmth, Arya felt changed somehow, marked perhaps by something she'd felt but couldn't name. The wildness in her blood sang a little louder, the connection to her ancestors ran a little deeper. She was a Stark of Winterfell, a daughter of the North, and the old gods had seen her, known her, accepted her as their own. Whatever came next, whether King Robert's visit, or Jon's departure to the Wall, or the countless unknowns that future held, she would face it with that knowledge burning bright within her. Winter was coming, but the Starks would endure. They always had. The fourth and final evening of storytelling arrived with a bitter cold that seemed to settle into Winterfell's very bones. The snow had fallen steadily throughout the day, transforming the castle into a white fortress against an iron-grey sky. Now, as darkness claimed the north once more, the family gathered for what they all understood would be the last of these special nights, at least for a time. Tomorrow, the preparations for King Robert's arrival would consume everyone. The easy intimacy of these evenings would give way to the formality and pageantry required when hosting the realm's sovereign. But tonight, for a few hours more, they were simply the Starks, a family sharing warmth and stories against the encroaching winter. The younger children had been sent to bed early. Rickon was already asleep, Bran fighting against exhaustion, but finally surrendering to his nurse's insistence. Even Arya had gone, though reluctantly, her fierce spirit unable to overcome the weariness of a long day spent racing through the snow-covered yards. Only the older members of the family remained, Ned and Catelyn, Robb and Sansa, Jon and Theon. The gathering felt different with this smaller group. More serious, perhaps, weighted with the knowledge that childhood was ending, that the world beyond Winterfell's walls was about to intrude with all its complexities and demands. Eddard Stark stood by the great hearth, his back to the fire, studying the faces of those he loved most in the world. His wife, constant and strong despite the difficulties of northern life. His heir, growing into manhood with steady grace. His daughters, Sansa, so like her mother. Jon, who bore the secret that weighted Ned's honour every day of his life. Even Theon, the Ironborn hostage who had become something approaching family despite the circumstances of his presence. 4 nights of stories, Ned said quietly. 4 nights of remembering who we are, where we've come from, what duties we carry forward. Tonight, I want to speak not of the past, but of the future, of what comes next, for each of you and for our house. Catelyn shifted in her seat, a small movement that Ned recognized as concern. They had discussed this, the necessity of preparing the children for what lay ahead, the changes that Robert's visit would bring, but discussing it and actually speaking the words aloud were different things. King Robert arrives within days, Ned continued, and with him comes the entire royal court, Queen Cersei, the Lannister children, advisors and guards and servants. Winterfell will be transformed. The quiet we've enjoyed these past evenings will vanish in a storm of southern voices and southern expectations. "Why is he really coming, Father?" Robb asked, his young face serious. "You've said it's to visit an old friend, to see the north. But kings don't travel this far north without reason. What does he want from us?" Ned felt pride at his son's perception, mixed with sorrow that such wisdom was necessary. "I don't know with certainty," he admitted, "but I suspect Robert will offer me a position at court. Perhaps Hand of the King. Jon Arryn held that office until recently, and Jon was like a father to both Robert and myself. The king may think I'm the only man he can trust in that role." "Would you accept?" Catelyn asked, though they had discussed this privately many times. "I would have to consider it carefully," Ned said. "The Hand serves the realm, helps govern the Seven Kingdoms, stands as the king's primary advisor. It's a position of tremendous responsibility and honor." He paused. "It's also a gilded cage. The Hand must live in King's Landing, immerse himself in court politics, navigate the treacherous waters of southern intrigue." "You hate politics," Robb observed. "I'm not skilled at it," Ned corrected gently. "There's a difference. I can govern the North well enough. Our people value directness, honor, clear speech. But the South," he shook his head, "the South plays games I was never taught, values cleverness over honesty, rewards those who can smile while sliding a knife between your ribs." "Then refuse," Sansa said, her voice carrying unexpected firmness. "If it would make you unhappy, if it would take you from Winterfell, refuse the king." Ned looked at his eldest daughter with affection. "Would that it were so simple, sweet child. But when your king asks you to serve, refusal becomes complicated. Robert is my oldest friend. He needs help governing a realm he never wanted to rule. How can I abandon him when he calls?" "By remembering that you have duties here as well," Catelyn said quietly. "To the north, to your bannermen, to your family. Those obligations don't vanish simply because a king makes demands." "No," Ned agreed, "they don't. Which is why this decision weighs so heavily." He looked at each of them in turn. "If I accept, and I'm not saying I will, but if I do, it would change everything. I would need to travel south, likely take some of you with me. Sansa, perhaps, to serve as a lady at court, to see the world beyond the north." Sansa's face lit up with barely contained excitement. The south, King's Landing, the royal court. These were the dreams that filled her romantic imagination, the stories she'd absorbed from songs and tales. "And Robb would need to stay," Ned continued, watching his heir's expression shift to understanding. "As my son and heir, you would hold Winterfell in my absence. You're young for such responsibility, but you've been well trained. And your mother would remain to counsel you, to help navigate the complexities of northern politics." Robb straightened slightly, unconsciously adopting the bearing of a lord, despite his 14 years. "I could do it," he said, not boasting but stating what he believed to be fact. "I know the bannermen, understand our obligations, have studied law and custom. With Mother's help, I could hold the north." "I know you could," Ned said, pride evident in his voice. You're your grandfather's grandson, Hoster Tully's strategic mind combined with stark integrity. You'll make a fine lord of Winterfell when the time comes, perhaps sooner than any of us expected." He turned to Jon, and the temperature in the room seemed to drop despite the roaring fire. This was the conversation they all knew was coming, the decision that would reshape Jon's entire existence. "You've spoken of taking the Black," Ned said quietly, "of joining the Night's Watch, serving at the Wall. Is this still your intention?" Jon met his supposed father's, eyes steadily. "It is. There's no future for me here, not truly. I'm a bastard. I have no lands to inherit, no house to build, no legacy to leave beyond the snow name and whatever reputation I forge myself. But at the Wall—" He paused, gathering his thoughts. "At the Wall, I could be something, could serve something greater than myself. The Night's Watch cares nothing for birth. Bastards and lordlings stand equal once they've taken the Black. And the work matters. Guarding the realm, holding the border, standing watch, against whatever darkness might come." "You understand what you're giving up?" Ned asked, his voice rough with emotion. "The vows are for life, Jon. No wife, no children, no lands or titles. Once you say the words, there's no turning back." "I understand," Jon said, "and I'm certain. This is my path, Father, the only path that makes sense for me." Ned was silent for a long moment, and Catelyn saw the war in his expression. Relief, perhaps, that the secret he carried would be safer with Jon beyond the Wall, mixed with profound sorrow at losing this boy he'd raised as a son. Whatever the truth of Jon's parentage, whatever promises Ned had made, the love was real. The grief of separation was genuine. "Then I'll write to my brother Benjen," Ned said finally. "He's first ranger at Castle Black, serves with distinction. He'll see you settled, ensure you're treated fairly. And I'll provide you with a horse, good weapons, warm clothing for the journey. You'll go to the Wall as a Stark, even if the name is not truly yours to claim." Jon's throat worked, emotion threatening to overwhelm his composure. "Thank you," he managed, "for everything. For raising me, training me, treating me better than many lords treat their acknowledged bastards. I know it wasn't easy, that my presence complicated things. But I'm grateful, nonetheless." Catelyn felt a complex tangle of emotions. Relief that Jon would leave, removing the daily reminder of Ned's supposed infidelity. Guilt for that relief, for her treatment of an innocent boy who'd done nothing to deserve her coldness. Sorrow for her husband, who was losing a child he clearly loved. And beneath it all, a nagging unease, the sense that there was more to Jon's story than anyone was saying, secrets that might someday reshape everything they thought they knew. "Theon," Ned said, turning to the Ironborn boy who sat slightly apart from the family circle, as he always did. "Your future is less certain. You've lived at Winterfell for 9 years now, grown from boy to man under our roof. But you remain the son of Balon Greyjoy, heir to the Iron Islands. One day that will matter." Theon's expression was carefully controlled, but Ned could see the warring impulses beneath. Pride in his Greyjoy heritage, resentment at his captivity, confused loyalty to the Starks who'd raised him, uncertainty about where he truly belonged. "My father still lives," Theon said, "still rules the Iron Islands from Pike. As long as he lives and doesn't rebel again, I remain here, your hostage, ward, whatever pretty word we use to mask the truth." "Yes," Ned said, not denying it. "That's the reality. But I would have you know this, Theon. I've tried to treat you fairly, to train you as I would my own sons. When you eventually return to the islands, You'll do so as a man educated in warfare, strategy, and governance. That knowledge could serve you well. Or could make me too much the wolf, too little the kraken, Theon replied, something bitter in his voice. Too northern for the islands, too ironborn for the north. A man of two worlds who belongs fully to neither. Ned nodded slowly, acknowledging the truth of it. That's a hard fate, and I won't pretend otherwise. But it's also an opportunity. You can bridge between two cultures, understand both sides in ways pure Northmen or pure Ironborn never could. That's valuable, Theon. Rare and valuable. Theon said nothing, but something in his expression suggested he was considering the words, turning them over in his mind. Sansa, Ned said, shifting attention to his eldest daughter. You dream of the South, of courtly life and knightly gallantry. If I accept the hand's position, you may get your wish. But I need you to understand something important. Sansa leaned forward, her blue eyes bright with attention. The South is not the songs, Ned said gently but firmly. The knights are not all gallant. The ladies are not all gracious. The court is not a place of romance and honour. It's a pit of vipers, Sansa. Beautiful, charming vipers who will smile while they destroy you if you give them the chance. I'm not a child, father, Sansa protested. I understand that reality differs from stories. Do you? Ned challenged, not unkindly. You're 11 years old, daughter. You've lived your entire life in the North, surrounded by people who value honesty and direct speech. The Southern lords play a different game. They lie as easily as breathing, manipulate without conscience, betray their own kin for advantage. If you go south, you must be constantly on guard. Trust no one completely. Remember always that you are a Stark, and the Starks have enemies we don't even know about yet. Sansa's excitement dimmed slightly, tempered by her father's serious tone. But Catelyn could see that her daughter didn't truly grasp the warning, couldn't imagine the dangers Ned was trying to describe. How could she? Winterfell was safe, the North was ordered, the people Sansa knew were fundamentally decent. The concept of a place where treachery was commonplace remained abstract, impossible to fully comprehend. I'll be careful, Sansa promised, and Mother will be there to guide me, won't she? Catelyn and Ned exchanged glances. They had discussed this as well, whether Catelyn would travel south with Ned or remain in the north with Robb. There were arguments for both choices, and no clear answer. We'll see, Catelyn said diplomatically. Much depends on what the king actually asks, what arrangements can be made. But yes, if you go south, I would prefer to be there with you. Which would leave me alone at Winterfell, Robb observed, holding the north at 14 with no parents present. Not alone, Ned corrected. Maester Luwin would remain, and Jory Cassell, and all the household you've known your entire life. The bannermen respect you already. You're my acknowledged heir, trained in governance, and I would return when I could, would stay in contact through ravens. It's not ideal, but it could work. If it must, Robb said, squaring his shoulders, I'll do what's required. Ned felt his heart clench at his son's courage, his willingness to shoulder burdens beyond his years. This was what honor demanded, what duty required. But it didn't make it easier to watch his children sacrifice their youth to necessity. These are possibilities, Ned said, addressing them all now. Not certainties. Robert may surprise me, may ask for something entirely different or nothing at all. But I wanted you to be prepared, to understand that change is coming whether we welcome it or not. He paused, looking into the fire as if seeking guidance from the flames. "Winter is coming," he said quietly. Our house words, spoken for 8,000 years. A warning, yes, prepare, endure, survive the hard times ahead. But also a promise. The Starks have weathered every winter, every catastrophe, every threat. We've stood when others fell, endured when others broke. We remember when others forget. And we will continue, Catelyn added, her voice strong and clear. Whatever comes, whether you go south or stay north, whether our family separates or remains together, we will endure. Because we are Starks and Tullys both, northern stone and southern water, old gods and new. That combination makes us strong. Ned turned from the fire to face them all, his expression solemn, but not despairing. "I want each of you to remember these nights," he said. "Remember the stories we've shared, the lessons we've tried to impart. Brandon and Lyanna's passion and its consequences. The importance of wisdom to temper strength. The bonds of family and duty, the old ways and their mysteries. All of it matters. All of it shapes who you are and who you'll become." He looked at Robb. "You'll be Lord of Winterfell someday, son. Perhaps soon, perhaps decades from now. Rule justly. Remember that the man who passes the sentence should swing the sword. Look your people in the eye when you make hard decisions, and never, ever forget that winter is always coming. Prepare, always prepare for the hardships ahead. To Sansa, guard your heart, daughter. Dream your dreams, but don't let them blind you to reality. You have your mother's grace and your father's honor. Let both guide you. And remember that being a lady is not about embroidery and courtesies, but about strength and wisdom and the courage to do what's right even when it's hard." To Jon, "You'll wear the black soon. Take vows that bind you for life. Serve with honor, stand your watch faithfully. But remember, you're a Stark in all but name. The wolf blood runs in your veins. Let it make you strong, but don't let it make you reckless. The Wall needs steady men, not heroes who die gloriously and accomplish nothing." To Theon, "You'll return to your father's halls eventually. When you do, remember that there's more than one way to be strong, more than one definition of honor. The old way of the Ironborn served its purpose once, but the world has changed. Be wise enough to adapt while honoring your heritage." The weight of Ned's words settled over them like snow, quiet, inexorable, transformative. This was more than a father's advice. This was a lord preparing his heirs for a future he could sense approaching, but not clearly see, arming them with whatever wisdom he possessed against trials he could not predict. "I love you all," Ned said simply. "That's what matters most. Whatever happens, wherever we end up, that truth remains. You are my children, my legacy, my hope for the future, and I am proud, so deeply proud, of who you're becoming." Robb stood first, crossed to his father, and embraced him wordlessly. Sansa followed, then Jon, each seeking and receiving the physical reassurance of familial love. Even Theon, after a moment's hesitation, joined the embrace, accepted into the circle despite his uncertain position. Catelyn watched from her seat, her own eyes bright with unshed tears. She saw her husband surrounded by the children he'd raised, the family he'd built despite war and loss and the weight of secrets that bowed his shoulders. Whatever came next, whatever demands Robert made, whatever changes swept through their lives, this moment was real. This love was true. Outside, the wind howled through Winterfell's stones, carrying the bite of deep winter. Snow fell steadily, blanketing the north in white. And somewhere beyond sight and knowledge, the future gathered like storm clouds on the horizon, bringing kings and queens, wars and betrayals, separations and losses that would test everything the Starks believed about honor and duty and family. But for tonight, they stood together, warm and safe and united, a family bound by blood and love and 8,000 years of history. Winter was coming, but the Starks would endure. They always had. And somewhere in the godswood, the weirwood watched with its carved face and weeping red eyes, remembering this moment as it remembered all moments, holding the family in its ancient awareness. The old gods saw, the old gods knew, and the old gods waited, as they always waited, for winter's true test to begin.